From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Last week, the question on Joe Manchin's deal with Chuck Schumer was what he was getting in the bargain. He has signed on to a climate bill that includes about $430 billion of spending and about $327 billion in taxes. And he claimed that he had some permitting deal that was going to be coming. And on Monday, there were more details released about this. There's a one-pager floating around which suggests some permitting reforms that Manchin thinks the Senate might take up. And I'll just read a few of them. One, it says, address excessive litigation delays. That's on permitting for construction projects, pipelines, roads, what have you. Set statute of limitations for court challenges. It would allegedly put some shot clocks on the National Environmental Policy Act, environmental reviews, 2 years for major projects, 1 year for less large projects. And Alicia, I wonder what you make of this. I mean, one of my thoughts here is just that the devil is always in the details. And Joe Manchin says he wants to set a statute of limitations on court challenges to these environmental permits for building projects, but he doesn't say what the statute of limitations would be. And it makes a huge difference whether it's 5 years or 2 years or 6 months.
Right. And really, that's not the problem. Increasingly, when a project gets permitted, the environment green groups are already ready to sue right away. In fact, sometimes they sue preemptively. I don't see a lot in this summary that they've put out that will make all that much of a difference. The 2-year shot clock that you alluded to, well, that was actually already part of the infrastructure bill that they passed last year. Courts are very reluctant to require regulatory agencies to actually abide by congressional set deadlines. We saw that with the census a couple years ago when the Ninth Circuit just waved away a requirement that Congress set that the census be completed by the end of December, saying that, well, it's more important that the census collectors, they do a thorough job. And in this case, that's also been what the judges have ruled when the Trump administration has tried to expedite reviews and put a shot clock. Federal judges have said, no, you need to take your time. You need to do all this thorough work. But the broader issue here is that not actually just on the federal regulatory side. Yes, it can take a few years to get the permits, and there are multiple permits project developers must obtain, but the litigation that can just drag on for years. The Mountain Valley Pipeline, that has been a priority project for Joe Manchin because it would provide an outlet for West Virginia's natural gas production. Right now, it's kind of, there's a bottleneck, a natural gas pipeline bottleneck, and this would provide a means to ship more and therefore produce more gas. The problem there isn't actually on the regulatory side. Various agencies, the Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wild Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Army Corps of Engineers. These agencies have all provided the required permits. The problem is that green groups keep challenging the permits and the judges keep striking them down and forcing the agencies to go back and actually redo all their environmental analysis, which then takes many more years. And so that's why it is now nearly 5 years behind schedule.
Well, let me follow up on that because the Mountain Valley Pipeline is the last item on this list. And I understand why the senator from West Virginia is very interested in a pipeline that's being built that would run from West Virginia to the eastern seaboard and carry natural gas. But here's what the Manchin document says. It says, complete the Mountain Valley Pipeline, require the relevant agencies to take all necessary actions to permit the construction and operation of the Mountain Valley Pipeline and give the D.C. Circuit jurisdiction over any further litigation. And if I understand you right, Alicia, what you're saying is that he can say in this document, complete the Mountain Valley Pipeline, but there's not a whole lot that Congress can do unless it's going to somehow intervene to exempt it from the litigation that's going on. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I agree with that. One issue with this particular pipeline project, and actually another pipeline project, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, that was actually canceled a couple of years ago, is that, judges keep on striking these permits, reading new requirements for environmental analysis that Congress never set and quibbling with their reviews. In this case, Joe Manchin has suggested, well, maybe we should just actually give the D.C. Circuit jurisdiction over any future litigation, because in both these cases, the Mountain Valley Pipeline and the Atlantic Coast, it's been the same 3 judges on the Fourth Circuit who have been striking down these permits. I'm a little skeptical that this is going to make much of a difference because the D.C. Circuit also tends to lean left and they may just be just as hostile. Again, it only applies to future litigation. So the problem is you really can't bind these third-party groups that keep suing, and you can't really bind the judges. So to your point, unless you just automatically make it immune to lawsuits, which I don't think Democrats are going to agree to, and that may actually, impose constitutional concerns. I don't think there's anything that Congress could actually do. Well, there are things that larger reforms that they could do to discourage litigation, but I don't think there's anything in this summary that will make much of a difference.
But I guess that's why I say that the details matter, because while I appreciate having this one-page fact sheet about some of these permitting ideas that are now floating through Joe Manchin's head, and maybe through Chuck Schumer's head, we'll give it that, it is still really hard to evaluate what a lot of this stuff means. And Kim, that's why I find myself still wondering whether Joe Manchin and Democrats could get to some sort of agreement on all the details they would need to do to pass a package like this. And I'll just pick another one. He says he wants to improve the process for developing categorical exclusions under the National Environmental Policy Act, which again is this law that requires environmental reviews of projects. So I get that in theory. You have some projects that get categorical exclusions to those reviews. But if you get down into the weeds about what projects and what are the exceptions and what are the loopholes, a huge chunk of the Democratic Party is going to want to make exceptions to that rule large enough to drive a dump truck through. And so, Kim, I mean, am I wrong to wonder whether there's anything along these lines that can really get the broad agreement that Joe Manchin seems to think he has?
All you have to do is look at the furious response from environmental groups and even some Democrats to the few provisions that Joe Manchin got in this bill, for instance, in terms of offshore leasing, et cetera, other future fossil fuels development. They're furious about it. And we also have some of those who were getting subsidies like electric vehicle manufacturers now whining about some of the provisions he required, for instance, make components of batteries in the United States. The idea that Democrats are going to allow even half of these proposals is somewhat ludicrous to me, given how militant they have become on green issues in recent years. So I appreciate Joe Manchin's hopefulness here, I guess, but I don't see a pathway for this. Just one broader point on this as well, too. What is frustrating and what we're fundamentally having a discussion about here and why it is so complicated is because we're discussing Band-Aids. Alicia just alluded to broader reforms. This is what is actually necessary. The reason we're having to do all this is because we've got a number of environmental statutes on the books, whether it's the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, that are 50 years old. They have never been touched. They've never been updated. They were created at a time when we just had a very different mindset in this country about energy projects. No one really envisioned the degree to which the courts were going to begin running this process. And there's going to have to be a fix to these things, or else this is going to become the status quo going forward.
But final thought here, stepping back again at this larger deal, which includes this reconciliation bill, taxing spending on green energy, and then, if that passes, this permitting deal with Joe Manchin. So what's currently happening, Alicia, is the reconciliation package has to go to the parliamentarian, because anything that's in there that is not counted as a budget item cannot pass through reconciliation rules with only 50 votes. So, Alicia, do you foresee that there's any real barrier to that, or do you think that the parliamentarian is going to wave this on by?
Well, I think there are a lot of components of the deal that could pose problems. So the budget reconciliation rules don't allow provisions to be inserted that would have major policy impacts. And that has proven a headache for Republicans when they were trying to reform the tax code in 2017 and when they failed to do healthcare reform because they had to follow the specifications of the budget reconciliation rules as interpreted by the parliamentarian. In this case, I think that there are whole swaths of the drug pricing reform that could be problematic, especially their particular provision that would require drug makers to pay rebates to the government if they raise their prices more than inflation going forward. Now, this would apply to the private markets too. So it's essentially a price control on the private markets. And this is actually where they get a lot of their revenue, at least $50 billion in revenue there, just from applying to the private markets. And so I think if that falls, the concern is, or if that isn't allowed, there's a concern, even among Democrats, that, well, then the private insurers are going to squawk because then drug makers are just going to pass on and raise their prices for privately insured patients and employer plans, just like the hospitals have done, because Medicare basically imposes price controls on hospitals and providers. And so what has happened is hospitals have just raised their costs for private patients. And so I think you're going to get a big pushback if the parliamentarian actually ends up ruling against that provision, and that could end up blowing up the entire deal. We'll see. I mean, that's perhaps an optimistic outlook, but I think there is a chance.
Stay tuned and keep an eye also on Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who has been pretty quiet about this deal, maybe hoping that the parliamentarian will save her from having to make a decision on it. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.